afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. We come to the end of the sixth year in review, and it is time to let our hair down and indulge in some interesting facts. Did you know? We begin with a person, Albert Einstein, who, like almost no other person in history, symbolizes human intellect and creativity at its zenith. He was chosen the person of the century at the turn of the last century by Time magazine. What is it about Einstein that makes his mystique so alluring? Well, it is Einstein's brain. After his death in 1955, his brain was removed, fixed, and photographed from multiple angles. It was then sectioned into 240 blocks, and histopathology slides were prepared. 14 of those photographs, taken from unconventional angles, were discovered only recently and described in meticulous detail in this paper in the journal Brain a few years ago. As can be seen, the photographs have been developed on old style photographic paper, but the prints are quite clear. The various parts of the brain have been labeled. And what were the findings? Simply put, Einstein had a remarkable brain. He had an extraordinary prefrontal cortex with greatly increased number of convolutions and complexity, which was the substrate for his remarkable cognitive abilities. It is not out of place to mention here that prefrontal cortex is associated with abstract thinking of the kind that was likely required for Einstein's famous thought experiments, such as riding alongside a beam of light. There was also an unusual right somatosensory cortex with an expanded region corresponding to the left hand. And this was possibly related to the fact that Einstein was also an accomplished violin player. Einstein, will there ever be another like him? Next, this was an innocuous sounding paper which was published in Nature in 1975. The opening lines were unassuming, and I quote, "The manufacture of predefined specific antibodies by means of permanent tissue culture cell lines is of general interest. The description of research is simplicity personified," and I quote again, we describe here the derivation of a number of tissue culture cell lines which secrete anti-sheep RBC antibodies. The manuscript begins on page 495. The authors were apparently successful in their task of making anti-sheep RBC antibodies, as can be seen from the halo of hemolyzed RBCs on this culture plate. The paper ends equally unassumingly on page 497, all of 3 pages long. Ladies and gentlemen, Georges Kohler on your right and Caesar Milstein on your left, the discoverers of hybridoma technique for making monoclonal antibodies on which much of modern biology and therapy is based. With Niels Jern, they received the Nobel Prize, and very deservingly so, in 1984. Next, life imitating art is a proposition that has been held by several artists and philosophers. But does art imitate life? These are paintings by Flemish and other masters of the Renaissance period in 15th and 16th centuries. You will note the beautiful depictions of the Virgin and the Christ child, But do you notice something else? If this was a live conference, I would surely have asked for a show of hands. The magnificent depiction, ladies and gentlemen, of the upgoing planter in the Christ child by the old masters, published in the venerable British Medical Journal a few months ago. Babinski first described the phenomenon d'octet or the toe phenomenon in a presentation to the Biological Society of Paris in 1896. The Babinski sign or the upgoing planter has been considered a strong sign of pyramidal tract dysfunction. Because this tract is not well developed in neonates, dorsiflexion of the big toe can be observed in them either spontaneously or on stimulation of the sole. The master painters had captured this centuries before its physiological description. This is the observational analysis published in BMJ. The bar chart shows the proportion of times that various painters depict the Babinski sign. And the author's conclusion: the Rhenish and Flemish painters depict their subjects realistically, while their Italian counterparts, including the good old Da Vinci, idealize their subjects. Next on my list is the summary of vital statistics of the New York City. And you may well ask, what is so mysterious or interesting about such a mundane document? Because, my friends, the longitudinal time trend analysis of mortality in the New York City is one of the greatest epidemiological trends of all time. This is also famously known as the conquest of pestilence in New York City. On the y-axis is mortality, and on the x-axis is calendar time in decades. This tells us that the monumental gains in human health antedated the modern era of medicine and was the direct result of population interventions like safe water supply, nutrition, hygiene, housing, and others. You will also note that the gains in the modern era in the past 8 to 9 decades have been relatively modest. And therefore, ladies and gentlemen, as physicians and oncologists, it is not a bad idea to be aware of the social determinants of health. Next, how many years are equal to 1 year of a dog's life? Conventional wisdom has it that 1 year of a dog's life is approximately equal to 7 human years. All mammals pass through similar life stages of embryogenesis, birth, infancy, youth, adolescence, maturity, and senescence, depicted beautifully and poignantly in this wonderful movie. In recent years, the mechanisms of the molecular clock of aging is beginning to be understood but is not yet well defined. One prominent molecular alteration that has been associated with aging is the changing pattern of epigenetic modifications, specifically methylation at the CpG dinucleotide locations. The methylation status of tens of thousands of CpG residues has been found to change predictably over time with aging, enabling the construction of what we would call the epigenetic aging clock. So, in this study, the investigators sequenced the methylomes of 104 Labrador retrievers spanning an age range of 16 years, and compared this with methylome patterns in humans of varying ages. Is 1 year of a dog life really equal to 7 human years in a linear fashion? It turns out that going by the epigenetic clock, there is a nonlinear correlation between dog and human aging. You will note that during the early years, dogs age much faster than humans, such that a dog reaches the middle age by 4 to 5 years, equivalent to 50 to 55 years of human life. But after that, it is the converse, with dogs aging much slower than human beings. The epigenetic signature primarily affects modules of developmental genes, likely turning them on or off in a coordinated manner. And this signature is conserved across many mammalian species. So, ladies and gentlemen, aging and death is built into the fabric of life. These pictures would be a marketer's delight. Customers keenly browsing their products are interested customers who enthusiastically buy the product that your company makes. Always good news? It seems that this is not always the case. In this interesting paper published in the Journal of Market Research, the authors correlate the probability of a product's success based on who buys it. They identify a set of individuals, colorfully termed harbingers of failure, who systematically purchase new products that flop. If this set of individuals adopts a new product early, it is a strong signal that the product will fail. These findings challenge the conventional wisdom that positive customer feedback is always a signal of future success. I leave it to you to ponder the reasons for this association and the commercial possibilities that emerged therefrom. I must confess that I have a strong suspicion and have been told that I also belong to this strange tribe. Log or linear? This picture from the New York Times from March 2020 shows the trend of the number of coronavirus infections over time, and the y-axis is plotted on an arithmetic scale. You would say that both Italy and US show a similar pattern of increase in cases over time, separated by some lag in the US. But lo and behold, as soon as you plot the y-axis on a logarithmic scale, it becomes apparent that the trend of infection is slowing in Italy, bending the curve, if you will, but is exponentially increasing in the US. So, a fundamental and important question is the following: are human brains hardwired to map numbers linearly or logarithmically? This also assumes importance because mapping of numbers onto space is fundamental to measurement and to mathematics. Is this mapping a cultural invention or a universal intuition shared by all humans regardless of culture and education? This interesting question was explored in this study where number space mappings were compared between Western adults and the Munduruku, an Amazonian indigenous group with little or no formal education. Each participant was provided a set of numbers on a computer screen, represented by either dots or tones or words, and asked to place its position between the two extremes using the click of a mouse and the cursor. And the findings? It turns out, very interestingly, that the Munduruku placements closely follow a logarithmic pattern for almost all sets of numbers, large and small. On the other hand, Western adults map numbers for the most part linearly, except for large numbers which begin to resemble the logarithmic scale. It seems that human brains are hardwired to map numbers logarithmically, and that the concept of a linear number line appears to be a cultural invention that fails to develop in the absence of formal education. Is milk good for human health? The natural function of milk is to nourish and promote the growth of young mammals. It contains all the essential nutrients as well as multiple anabolic hormones to achieve this objective. However, in recent times, in order to increase milk production, cows have been bred to produce higher levels of insulin-like growth factor, and furthermore, they are pregnant for most of the time that they are milked, which greatly increases the levels of hormones such as progestins, estrogens, and others. This is a very nice review article published in the New England Journal of Medicine about 1 year ago, and I recommend that you read it because of the number of questions that we and our patients have with respect to milk. It seems that even with adequate overall nutrition, milk consumption augments longitudinal growth and the final attained height of humans. A central rationale for recommending high lifelong milk consumption has been to meet the calcium requirements for bone health. But wait, it actually turns out that countries with a higher proportional milk intake have a higher, I repeat, a higher incidence of hip fractures rather than the reverse. This review nicely summarizes the evidence for association between milk intake and various outcomes listed here. It also describes the equivocal associations of some of these outcomes with milk intake. But the total all-cause mortality is interesting and important. The horizontal blue line that I have highlighted here is the comparator milk group. And so, compared to milk, plant sources result in significantly reduced all-cause mortality, while eggs and processed meat result in significantly higher all-cause mortality compared with milk. It is instructive to read and assimilate the conclusions of the authors. The current recommendations to greatly increase consumption of dairy foods to 3 or more servings per day does not appear to be justified. And further, guidelines for milk intake should emphasize an acceptable intake such as 0 to 2 servings per day, de-emphasize the utility of reduced fat milk for which there isn't adequate proof, and discourage consumption of sugar-sweetened dairy foods. And finally, a piece of sporting history. The most beautiful goal ever scored in the history of football.
Ahí lo tiene Maradona, lo marcan dos, pisa la pelota Maradona, arranca por la derecha el genio del fútbol mundial, y es el tercero a tocar para Borruchaga siempre Maradona, genio, 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 ta, 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 ¡y gol! ¡Y gol! ¡Y gol!
We remember this genius who brought joy to countless millions of his fans worldwide. I thank you for your attention.